All right, today we're going to do a little time traveling. We're going to dig into a problem that honestly feels like it could be from this week, but we're going to look at it through the lens of 2005. It was a world totally drowning in data chaos, but dreaming of a much smarter future. Let's see what we can learn from their story.
So, just how chaotic are we talking? Well, get ready for this. Back in 2005, the average company wasn't using one or two reporting tools. Nope. They were juggling this many 13. Seriously, 13 different BI tools, often from a handful of different vendors. It was a total mess, a tangled web of duplicate data, conflicting reports, and just, crazy high costs.
And all that chaos created this massive headache for leadership. They were wrestling with two huge questions. First, how on earth do you even start to manage all this complexity and standardize? And second, maybe even more important, how do you justify the enormous cost and effort to clean it all up? Proving the value was just as critical as doing the work. So here's our game plan. We're going to follow that journey. We'll kick things off with a standardization challenge itself, then see how they even figured out if they were succeeding. Then, of course, the big money question. What was the actual ROI? And finally, we'll look at the future they imagined. And, well, how close we've actually come to it.
Okay, first up, the standardization challenge. You see, the real problem wasn't just having too many tools. It was what those tools created, something the report calls analytic silos. Basically, every department was its own little island of data, with its own tools and, this is the important part, its own version of the truth. You can just imagine the meetings, right? Total nightmare. So how did things get so out of hand? Well, what's fascinating is that this wasn't really a technology problem at its core. It was a people problem. The biggest reason, by far, was departmental autonomy. You had different teams just going out and buying whatever software they wanted. Kind of like the Wild West. You throw in some mergers and acquisitions, and boom, you've got a perfect storm for chaos.
So with a problem this huge and this messy, how did these companies know if they were actually making any progress? That brings us to our next question. How in the world was success even measured back then? Well, one of the clearest signs of progress was a massive shift in strategy. By 2005, a full 2/3 of organizations were actively trying to change BI from this scattered, departmental thing into a single unified resource for the entire enterprise. And that's a big deal, because it shows this wasn't just some IT pet project anymore. It had become a core business goal. But did it work? Was all that pain and effort actually worth it? Well, for the companies that went through with it, the answer was a pretty loud yes. Look at this. A solid majority, 58%, rated their efforts a high or very high success. It just goes to show that once they got past that initial struggle, the benefits were very, very real. Okay, so people felt good about it. That's great. But you know what really matters in the C-suite? Hard numbers. So what was the actual return on investment? How did these projects pay for themselves?
Yeah, you can't just walk into the CFO's office and say, hey, we've got one version of the truth now. You have to prove it with numbers. So let's take a look at what those numbers were.
Let's start with the big one. And this is kind of wild. Only about 9% of companies actually bothered to calculate a formal ROI. But for those that did, the average return was a massive 60%, over just 3 years.
And what about just pure hard cost savings? Well, the average annual savings just from getting rid of all those redundant tools, servers, and training programs was nearly $800,000. That's a number that proves cleaning up the chaos absolutely pays for itself and then some.
But this was never just about the money. Leaders back then had a much bigger, almost philosophical vision for what BI could become. They weren't just thinking about saving a few bucks. They were trying to completely reimagine how people would interact with data itself. And that vision was for BI to become an invisible utility. I love that phrase. Think about electricity. You don't think about the power grid or the substations. You just flip a switch and the light comes on. It just works. That was the goal for business intelligence, for it to be so seamless and integrated that you just take it for granted. This quote from the report just nails it. The real goal wasn't to build fancier dashboards or get people to log into some special BI tool. No, it was to weave intelligence so deeply into the applications people used every day that it just became second nature. No extra steps, no second thought. So if that's the dream, what was the roadmap to get there?
How did they see the technology itself needing to change to make this invisible utility a reality? Let's look at the final piece of the puzzle. To make it happen, you needed a fundamental tech shift. It meant moving away from the old world. That's the siloed data, the clunky desktop tools, the local control, and moving toward a new model, one built on standardized data, delivered through easy-to-use, web-based platforms, and all managed centrally. This was the key that was supposed to unlock BI for everyone. And let me tell you, the demands for these new enterprise platforms were huge. They had to do it all. They needed the breadth to support every single type of user, the depth to handle really complex analysis, and the raw scalability to support thousands of people at the same time, all delivered seamlessly over the web. That was an incredibly high bar back in 2005. And that brings us to the big question I want to leave you with. Looking back from today, nearly 2 decades later, did we do it? Did we achieve that vision? Has business intelligence truly become that invisible utility that just seamlessly powers our decisions? Or are we still wrestling with the exact same challenges? Too many tools, siloed data, and always having to prove our value. It's something to think about. What do you think? Is BI invisible in your organization? I'd love to hear about it, so let us know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this little trip into the history of data, make sure you like, share, and subscribe for more explainers. Thanks for watching.